They say Lake Serra Azul is calm, beautiful, silent. But those who have lived there for a long time know the silence of that place is not natural. It's heavy, thick, as if something were waiting. It was a Friday, and I was traveling for work with students from an American school, and our destination was the lake cabin. There were a total of 40 students, including boys and girls. I was the monitor for the girls and another teacher for the boys. We were going to stay for 2 days. We got on the school bus and headed to our destination. It was a long trip of almost 4 hours, and at first everything seemed too ordinary. The students laughed loudly, sang off-key songs, took pictures out the window, while the city receded into the distance and the roads became increasingly narrow and surrounded by open fields. The sky was absurdly blue, almost perfect, and the mountains in the distance looked hand-painted. Tall trees lined the road like a silent escort, and for a moment I thought it would be a peaceful, perhaps even relaxing weekend. As we drove on, the houses disappeared, gas stations became rarer, and the phone signal began to fluctuate until it vanished completely. But no one seemed to care. The students' excitement filled the bus with an energy too vibrant to notice the growing isolation. After the 3rd hour, the landscape began to change almost imperceptibly. The trees became denser, more closed, leaning slightly over the road as if they wanted to block the sky. The sunlight no longer hit the asphalt with the same intensity, and the driver commented jokingly that that part of the road always seemed colder. I felt it too. The air seemed different when we opened the windows for a few seconds, more humid, heavier, with a faint smell of wet earth even though it hadn't rained. With about 20 minutes to go, a thin mist began to appear between the trees, something strange for that time of day, and the students closest to the windows fell silent for a few moments as they realized that the forest seemed too still. No birds crossed the sky, no insects hit the glass. It was as if we were crossing a space suspended in time. When we finally rounded the last curve indicated on the map, the lake appeared between the trees, dark, still, too large for that valley. And even from a distance, I had the unsettling feeling that it did not reflect the clear sky above it, as if it were a solid surface, observing our arrival even before we parked in front of the wooden cabin that awaited us on the shore.
There was an old wooden bridge that separated the parking lot from the cabin. We got off the bus, still excited about the trip, and began to cross in a line, the planks creaking under the steps of 40 noisy students. The bridge was narrow and passed over a small stretch of still water that seemed connected to the main lake. Midway across, I felt the air grow colder, and a thin mist drifted slowly over the water, so low it seemed to touch the surface. On the other side were 2 large, old, dark wooden cabins with sloping roofs and wide windows. It was then that the person responsible for greeting us appeared at the main door. It was difficult to tell if it was a man or a woman at first glance. They wore a thick coat even though it wasn't that cold, and had a strange smile, one of those that appear too quickly and disappear too quickly as well. Their voice was low and calm when they welcomed us, but there was something in their gaze that seemed to measure each of us as we crossed the small stone courtyard. Upon entering the main cabin, I immediately noticed that the walls were covered with stuffed animals. There were deer heads, foxes, and a huge bear standing in a corner of the room, its claws outstretched as if still attacking something. The students were impressed and began pointing and taking pictures, but something there made me uncomfortable. On a higher shelf was a stuffed animal that I simply couldn't identify. The body seemed too elongated, with legs too thin for a wolf and teeth that resembled those of a fish more than a mammal. The skin was dark, almost black, and the glass eyes reflected the light from the window in a strange way, as if they were moist. I asked the receptionist what kind of animal it was, but he only replied that it had been found near the lake many years ago and that no one was sure what it really was. Some students laughed, thinking it was just a story made up to scare tourists, But at that moment, I looked out the window behind the cabin. The mist over the lake was thicker now, moving slowly over the dark water. And for a very quick second, I had the impression that something was moving under that mist, large enough to make the surface of the lake ripple before everything became completely still again.
The boys stayed in cabin 1 and the girls in cabin 2, separated by a few meters of wooden path between the trees. While everyone was busy packing backpacks, choosing beds, and laughing at the tiredness of the trip, a loud scream echoed through the place, apparently coming from the girls' cabin. The sound was so sudden that several students stopped at the same time. Alex, the monitor responsible for the boys, quickly left cabin 1 and went to cabin 2 to check what had happened, but when he entered, he found all the girls confused, looking at each other and saying that no one had screamed. The silence that followed was too strange, because at that moment, everyone realized that the scream had not come from there, but from some point further away, perhaps near the lake. For a few seconds, no one said anything, and one of the girls whispered that she had heard something similar while crossing the bridge. I tried to reassure everyone, but while I was talking, I had the unsettling feeling that someone was standing outside the cabin, listening. When I slowly turned to look out the window, there was only the mist from the lake moving slowly between the trees, as if it had gotten a little closer. It was almost 3 p.m., but the daylight seemed strangely weak, as if the afternoon was aging too quickly. While the students resumed their conversation and pretended nothing had happened, that feeling wouldn't go away, the feeling that there was someone else there, something that wasn't part of the group, something that wasn't exactly real. It was like entering a room and realizing, without knowing why, that someone had just left seconds before. The air inside the cabin seemed colder near the windows, and sometimes I had the impression of hearing light footsteps outside, walking slowly along the wooden deck. When I looked again toward the lake, the fog seemed thicker, and for a moment I had the unsettling feeling that it was moving against the wind, slowly, as if it were approaching the cabin. Then they decided to get together to play a game of questions, the famous Charlie Charlie, something that started as a simple joke to break the strange atmosphere that still hung over everyone. They pushed 2 tables into the center of the girls' cabin, grabbed paper and pencils, and began to prepare the game, while some students laughed nervously, trying to appear brave in front of the others. Outside, the sky, which had been clear a short time before, began to darken slowly, and a distant thunderclap echoed through the mountains, making the windows vibrate slightly. The first pencil was placed on top of the other, forming the cross on the paper divided into yes and no, and for a moment everyone was silent, watching as if expecting something to happen. It was then that a dry noise came from outside the cabin, something heavy hitting the wooden deck, followed by another closer thunderclap, which made some students immediately look toward the door. Maria was a girl unlike the others, sensitive, one of those who notice things that no one else notices. While the students chatted near the campfire, she slowly stood up and began walking towards the mist-covered lake. At first, we thought she just wanted to be alone for a moment, but we soon realized she was murmuring something, as if she were talking to someone beside her. Some students stopped laughing and watched in silence. The way she walked seemed strange, almost like a sleepwalker, except her eyes were open. When Maria finally returned from the edge of the lake, her face was pale and her eyes too fixed, and in a low voice, she said only one thing that made silence fall over everyone. He said, "We're already late because some of us are already in the water." After Maria said that sentence, a heavy silence fell over the group, as if even the sound of the campfire had diminished. It was then that someone noticed something strange. Anna was no longer there. Some students began to look around, calling her name, while the mist over the lake seemed to spread a little closer to the campfire. Before anyone could decide to go looking for her, a silhouette slowly emerged from the trees. It was Anna. She walked slowly towards the group, her gaze vacant, holding a small dead rabbit in her hands, its white fur stained red and her fingers covered in fresh blood. When she finally reached the light of the campfire, she lifted the animal as if displaying a trophy and said,
in a whisper too strange to be hers.
He said he needed something alive to start with.
It was then that everyone looked at each other, clearly frightened, and the monitors decided that no one else would be walking alone. The girls returned together to their cabin, while some boys went to the other cabin to get backpacks and blankets so that everyone could spend the night in the same place. In the midst of the commotion, Felipe began calling for his younger brother, Caio, suddenly realizing that he was not with the group. Concern began to grow when no one remembered seeing him leave. It was at that moment that a small figure appeared near the trail leading from the lake. It was Caio, standing among the trees, holding in his hands a strange doll made of branches tied with string and pieces of dry leaf. He stared intently at the doll as he walked slowly, and when Felipe asked where he had found it, Caio replied in a low voice, almost distracted, "I didn't make it. He told me to make it." Alex firmly stated that no one else would be leaving and hurried everyone into cabin 2, while Felipe kicked the twig dummy out of the way before closing the door. As soon as they entered, Caio suddenly began to feel ill, his face turning pale, his body trembling with fever, and soon he was bent over vomiting as if something was draining his strength from the inside out. Maria looked outside through the window and murmured that the dummy wasn't just a dummy, it was Caio. In the midst of the confusion, someone noticed something even worse. Lucas had also disappeared. Panic began to spread through the cabin until a few minutes later, the door slowly opened and Lucas entered, completely soaked, with seaweed clinging to his clothes, holding a second, larger twig dummy with pieces of human hair tied to it. When everyone asked where he had been, Lucas simply lifted the dummy and said with an empty smile, "He said there are still many more to go." It was almost 11 p.m., and panic was beginning to grip everyone inside the cabin. Outside came strange noises, footsteps on the wooden deck, branches breaking in the forest, and sometimes something that looked like water moving very close to the door. Maria, sitting at the back of the room with her eyes fixed on the window, repeated in a low voice that they needed to leave immediately, that the lake didn't want to wait until dawn. The counselors tried to remain calm and said that leaving in the dark would be worse, that as soon as the sun rose, everyone would get on the bus and leave that place behind. It was then that Maria slowly raised her head and said something that made everyone's blood run cold. "He just told me the bus won't be here when the day breaks." Panic completely dominated the cabin. Caio, Lucas, and Anna were sitting together in a corner, but something was wrong with them. They weren't crying, they weren't talking, they barely blinked. It was as if they were just there, existing, empty, with slow mechanical movements like forgotten dolls. Vera, the girl's monitor, began to pray aloud for protection, while some candles dimly illuminated the room. But suddenly they all went out at the same time, as if something had blown on them. The night seemed endless. Time inside the cabin had become heavy, distorted, as if the hours were trapped in that place along with them. But somehow, dawn finally arrived. Alex slowly opened his eyes, feeling his head heavy, his body strange, and an absolute silence all around. When he stood up, he immediately realized that almost no one was there anymore. The backpacks were on the floor, some beds unmade, but the students had disappeared. Not Caio, not Lucas, not Anna, not even Vera, the girl's monitor. With his heart racing, Alex left the cabin and walked to where the wooden bridge used to be. But the bridge was no longer there. The planks, the ropes, nothing. It was as if she had been ripped away during the night, or worse, as if she had never existed. On the other side, the school bus remained parked in the same place. Near it, a figure staggered out, crying, with hands covering her face. It was Maria. What? Alex thought.
In the early morning, the fog had slowly invaded the cabin, covering everything like a heavy blanket. One by one, they had all fallen asleep. But it wasn't normal sleep. It was too deep a sleep, too sleepwalking. And then they began to walk. silently, leaving the cabin, crossing the deck, heading towards the lake as if they were being called by something only they could hear. Maria had felt it before it happened. She prayed, closed herself off in prayer, trying to block that presence that seemed to pull everyone out. When she realized she couldn't wake them, she tried to call them, shake them, beg them to come back, but no one heard her. Their eyes were open, but they weren't really there. Desperate, Maria grabbed her things and ran across the bridge to the bus. On the other side, the air seemed normal. The weight disappeared. The fog didn't reach there, and she was the only one who resisted the lake's call. But at that moment, while crying near the bus, Maria didn't know one thing. Alex was looking at her, standing near the edge of the lake. But Alex was no longer alive. He watched Maria in silence, trying to scream, trying to call her name, trying to warn her, but no words came out. It was as if his voice was trapped underwater. Around him, other shapes moved slowly within the lake's fog, silhouettes of students, of teachers, all walking slowly on the dark surface, like reflections trapped between two worlds. Maria remained inside the bus for 4 days. 4 days without the courage to cross back, without enough food, sleeping little, crying a lot, until finally police cars arrived after the student's disappearance was reported by the school. When asked what had happened, Maria could only repeat one thing, that the lake had called them all. But when the police went to the shore, there was no cabin, there was no deck, there was no lake, just a silent clearing surrounded by trees. And years later, some residents of the region still say that on certain foggy mornings, it is possible to see figures standing looking at the road, as if they were still waiting for someone to arrive. Or worse, as if they were still waiting for someone to cross the bridge that never existed.